Hello, and welcome to Lip Service, a podcast that adventures around and all down the line with the Rolling Stones. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Simon Harper, and I shall be your host for this series of conversations that celebrate the life and music of the greatest rock and roll band in the world. We've got sights and sounds and marvels to delight your eyes and ears, so join us as we journey down the road a piece, from Dartford days to Hackney Diamonds and beyond, exploring the songs and stories from along the way with friends and special guests. Today's guest is Robert Greenfield, journalist, author, and one of the definitive chroniclers of rock and roll's most chaotic, colourful era. After immersing himself in the New York music scene of the early 60s, where he even once hosted a show at the famed Apollo Theatre, Robert moved to London at the end of the decade and became the UK correspondent for Rolling Stone. Writing for the magazine, he joined the Rolling Stones for their 1971 Goodbye Britain tour and then followed them to the south of France, where he conducted what became Keith Richards' first truly in-depth interview at his villa, Nellcôte, and witnessed sessions there for the classic album Exile On Main Street. Gaining the band's trust with his non-intrusive journalistic style, Robert shadowed the Stones on their 1972 US tour, a wild, decadent adventure brimming with sex, drugs and rock and roll that he captured in his iconic and evocative book STP, A Journey Through America with the Rolling Stones. He's since gone on to write numerous acclaimed works, including biographies on the Grateful Dead's Jerry Garcia and Atlantic Records co-founder Ahmet Ertegun, as well as revisiting his time with the Stones in two further books, Exile on Main Street, A Season in Hell with the Rolling Stones, and Ain't It Time We Said Goodbye, the Rolling Stones on the Road to Exile, cementing his place as one of the band's great historians. In our conversation, Robert reflects on his formative years as a writer, the crazy cast of characters that inhabited the Stones' travelling circus, including his personal takes on Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Charlie Watts and Mick Taylor, the naked truth behind the infamous Cocksucker Blues tour documentary, and how a lifetime of telling other people's stories has shaped his own. It's a captivating first-hand portrait of the Stones in their most untamed era, from a man who was right there at the heart of it all. So let's hear what he's got to say. Here is Robert Greenfield. Robert, welcome to Lip Service.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I've admired your writing for years, so it's a real pleasure to sit down and talk through your time with the Stones and everything that's followed.
Well, I think the implication there is that it's great that I'm still alive after all my time with the Stones, and as I talk to people, shocking as this seems even to me, but my time at Villa Nellcôte in the south of France was more than 50 years ago. So, yeah. And there were many who were there who are no longer with us, of course. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you're counting yourself lucky.
I do count. I thank you and grateful.
So like myself and others in our business, becoming a music writer, I believe, wasn't something that you had planned as a kid. So can you tell me what your ambitions were and what first led you down this murky path?
Murky indeed, especially when I lived in London. It was very murky every day, but that's not the point. I was always going to be a writer. That's all I ever wanted to be from childhood, bizarrely enough. And I went to the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and came from a college where you wouldn't get into a school like that. And you had to write an essay for them to judge your ability. And I've always thought this is semi-interesting. There was no internet back then, people. Just need you to know that, It wasn't as easy to verify facts. And I kind of had a sense that the only way they were going to let me in, which I think they did semi-grudgingly, is if I differentiated myself. And you have to remember back then, all of this music was, what am I going to say, considered beneath contempt? Not really, but generationally, it was ignored by anybody who wasn't of a certain age. And
there was no importance on it.
Well, we'll get to this, and again, things that astonish me because I don't think about them. STP, Journey Through America, was in fact the first full-length book ever published about a rock and roll tour. So you get the split people who ran publishing houses didn't think that those children, those kids, those hippies who went to Stones concerts or any were going to buy books. But as always, the Rolling Stones, well, I'm going ahead, but on that 72 tour, because of Ahmet Ertegun and Atlantic Records and Marshall Chess, they crossed into another realm where people of a more advanced age, because now all of a sudden they were so hip, and here was Ahmet, who was so socially acceptable. And so they played arenas everywhere, and they would front page news.
Hmm.
And so that's how I got to write that book, a first of its kind. But this was always what I cared about. I started going, I guess I was 15 years old when I went to my first Murray the K show in New York. And Murray Kaufman, was in a very wild but less combative manner the successor to Alan Freed,
Yeah.
whose big beat shows resulted in riots, more about the banning of rock and roll, this evil black music, and this is what they thought, especially in the South, seducing white girls. I mean, about as primitive as you could get in terms of well, kind of like what's going on in America now.
Sure.
Not so different. Yeah. Reactive, reactive America. And so here we go. I had gone to see Murray the K show on Easter and Passover, back when I was still 15. And Del Shannon, the Marcells. Um, well, the deal back then, for people who weren't there, and there probably weren't a lot, they did the show as a caravan show. Every act came out, did two or three songs. There was an orchestra band on stage that backed everybody, bam, bam, bam. And then Dick Clark did this with his caravan shows. And the MC would come out, introduce the next act, and no matter how many acts there were, and I went repeatedly and saw Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell, eventually a lot of Motown, saw Smokey and the Miracles when Claudette was still singing with him. Um, Even if there were 12 acts, maybe the stage show would be over in an hour. I remember, I think, and then they would show probably the most awful B movies that had ever been made. Now they wouldn't be the same movie shown repeatedly during the day. Why? Get kids to leave, bring more kids in the house. But if you were a fanatic like I was, and as Bruce Springsteen once said, my life was also saved by rock and roll, really. And the great escape back then was that I could listen to radio stations from places other than Brooklyn, on my transistor radio at night in bed with one earpiece. And my parents couldn't hear me. And I'd be dialing in stations to hear songs that weren't being played in New York. And so, in any event, if you were fanatical and you had paid, I don't know, I doubt it was $3 to get in. Well, what you would do is you'd see the stage show, then the movie would come on, and then you would move down.
Just shift
And
around.
you would get closer to the stage, and the movie was so bad. I mean, it was just like it, as they used to say in Hollywood, it had never been released, it had escaped. But if you were willing to put up with an hour and a half, that's what those movies were, you would definitely see the movie three times. And by the time you had memorized every awful line in the movie, you'd be sitting in the second or third row. So that's where I start with, going to shows. And then when I got in, based on this essay article I wrote, and it's always amused me that I wrote that Berry Gordy and Diana Ross had gotten married. Well, they hadn't. And
Yeah.
so nobody there could check it, no internet, but when I was there, I did my master's thesis on the Apollo Theater.
Yeah.
And so, I was there a week after week. Okay, so probably one of the great highlights of my career, maybe the greatest highlight of my career. And and I was, when I was on the first Stones tour, I was in the back of a car driven by the great Ian Stewart,
Yep.
Stu, who hell of a piano player, redoubtable man who just didn't like hippies. Not, Stu was prickly. He was could be dour, word it's hard to say. And I was just talking like I am now, something I do a lot. And I mentioned in passing that I had, in fact, introduced the afternoon show at the Apollo Theater. I
Right.
got there. Everybody knew me because I was just hanging out, which is what I always did when I was writing back then. And a great guy who was the stage manager, as I was standing backstage waiting for, nobody came to the afternoon show at the Apollo except junkies, winos, people who were snorting glue out of paper bags. They were looking for a place to hide from the cops, and they might have been interested in the music because the shows were incredible. And this guy, Hans, who was said to me, "You know how to read, right?" I said, "Yeah, I do." He said, "Go ahead." And on the microphone, you can see how clearly this is emblazoned in my memory. There was a taped list of the acts. And I've been there for weeks and very conscious that I'm a white boy in a black world. And so I do my best, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Apollo Theater. And I announce the acts. And it was just like, it's not going to get better than this. It was a thunderous moment. But I went there and I did my master's thesis on the Apollo. It actually begins. I was there on the day that Frankie Lyman died. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, and he had been a big favorite there. It was astonishing to me then because of Apollo was on what was then 125th Street. Now I think it's Martin Luther King Boulevard. Was the reverence and of course the amateur nights on Wednesday, which were an incredible cultural experience on every level. Incredible. People being booed off stage and run by this incredible guy named Honey Coles, who had been a great tap dancer. Um, that the master's thesis, no one had ever done that. You know what I mean? Especially not at that school. And what I didn't realize when I was telling this story, I really didn't. I was fairly unconscious back then. The first thing the Stones did when they came to New York for the first time was to go to the Apollo.
Naturally, yeah.
So all of a sudden, I got respect from Ian Stewart because he realized back then if it was all about the music. If you loved and you knew the music, you were accepted, and you can't fake it. They always know. Everybody who knows. And so it's not like I fell into the music thing. I mean, the music was always so important to me, and I cared so much about it. You should only write about the things that you really care about. And so, I guess it was, I don't know, predestined.
Yeah.
I had no choice. I wasn't, but I lie. I began as a sports writer. You needed to have a job, and I took a job, and I was the night guy, and I didn't last long. And then I moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and worked for Boston After Dark, and I was going to see rock bands. So this is all, I've
Yeah.
never had a real job. This is all I've ever done. So,
Well, if you choose the life of a music writer, that's your fate, isn't it? But I know you got your foot in the door at Rolling Stone and stuff. But at the end of the 60s, you decided to move to London. You said in another interview that you'd had it with America.
yes,
Why were you so disillusioned at that point?
it was, now what we're all living through here, and believe me, it's not so easy to be living here now. But back then, I mean, we were in the throes of a semi-violent revolution. Friends of mine were in prison. Friends of mine had committed suicide. Friends of mine had flipped out on acid and not really come back all the way. And I was writing freelance articles, not just about music, but about, the culture and what was going on in New York and stuff on the street. And I couldn't, as they used to say in Hollywood, I couldn't get arrested. They wouldn't even return the article. I'd call them and say, "Hey, listen, can I have it?" "Oh, we threw it away." "Oh, great. Thank you. That feels good. And then I had submitted something to Rolling Stone. They had an office in New York then. A wonderful woman named Lorraine Alterman, who was married to Peter Boyle, the actor,
Yeah.
who actually was one of the first women, along with Lillian Roxon, who's not with us. Lorraine had a column in Detroit, and I've been inveigling her to write her own book because I want her to use the title of the column. The name of the column was Teen Beat. There you go. And Connie Francis died today, and that's what it was all about. Back then, it was American Bandstand and Dick Clark and all the people that he featured. And so Lorraine called me. I was still living in my parents' house in Brooklyn and said, "Well, I'd like you to come work for me here at Rolling Stone." And I said, "I can't. I'm going to London." Okay. And she said, "Well, that's incredible because we have an opening there, and here's the name of the guy who runs the office." And so I get to London. I don't know anybody. I mean, I remember wandering around Euston Station on the night of the Ep9 Cup final. I'm in another world. This is not Brooklyn anymore. And I didn't last there long because the guy running it wanted his brother to get the job, didn't like me, didn't like hippies, you know, got insulted by Ginger Baker, violently, who was
But didn't
drunk and
everybody?
the list is endless. But I'll tell you something. Even at that point, and I left, London was so different because it was so much calmer and kinder. And the thing about being, I had no idea. I was a kid and had no idea why he went off on me, but he really did. And I walked out of the pub. And then Graham Bond, the great Graham Bond from the Graham Bond organization,
Yep.
he came after me and said, "Listen, don't take it personally. Has nothing to do with you. This is who he is." I took off. I wandered around Europe, hitchhiking and doing all that stuff for about 3 months. And then sat in the central train station in Rome for, I don't know, 8 or 10 hours, trying to decide whether I wanted to go east on the hippie trail to India or go west to the Isle of Wight Festival.
Hmm.
It sounds like an insane choice at the time
Well,
in
who was playing which
1970.
70? So what was that? The Who?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, The Who, Leonard Cohen, who I didn't see, I was asleep. He came on at 3 in the morning. Joni Mitchell,
Yeah.
Jethro Tull. Yeah, The Who were, oh, Hendrix,
Yeah.
one of the last. Jim Morrison and the Doors. Hendrix was not good. Morrison died not, well, kind of late. Hendrix died reasonably quickly after that.
Hmm.
200,000 people, 400,000 people. Gates came down, free concert, the whole 9 yards. It was everything. And then I don't know if there are coincidences. I don't know. So they were holding these press conferences, and this is my deal. I'm there. I'm there when it starts, and taking notes, and was in a big tent. And then I come outside, and this English guy, obviously very upset, befuddled, I would say, comes rushing up to me. He slept through it. I don't know him from Adam, and I miss. I said, and so I start telling him everything that went at like they said this, and they're going to do this, and oh, I'm so grateful. Thank you so much. And that person turned out to be Andrew Bailey, who had just taken over the London office of Rolling Stone from the person who did not like me. Andrew and I are still close friends, and we work together for the next 2 years. And the thing I will say, wherever you want to go from here, is that back then, the music business in London was so intense, so small
Hmm.
that everybody knew everybody. And you literally could go to lunch with Andrew, especially, who could schmooze. He'd worked for Variety. I mean, Andrew was incredible, one of the great hustlers of all time. And I know it was my idea. I wanted to do this. And Andrew said, "Oh, okay." And we went to lunch with Joe Bergman, who's now known as Georgia, who was the manager, basically. Klein was on the outs and ran them. And we were so different. Andrew was so suave and charming. And I was just this, I wasn't a boy, but I was something from America. And I told her what I wanted to do, and she agreed. And that's how I got to be on the Stones. Rolling Stone called it Goodbye Great Britain. That was the name of the article. It was their farewell tour
Yeah.
where they played in town halls and civic auditoriums, 2 shows a night. It was incredible.
That was that. Yeah, that was the start of them leaving for tax reasons to escape the country. The
Well, they
last.
left. They were leaving. They were
Yeah.
had to go in tax exile because they were in such bad shape. They owed so much money. And listen, one of the great memories from that, and try to. I know we were going to talk. It may have been at Paddington. I'm not sure. Well, no. The great thing about it then is like nobody introduced me to anybody.
Yeah.
Nobody knew who Jagger would have known because he had to say yes. But he didn't know what I looked like. No internet, you know. And he never traveled with everybody else anyways, Mick, you know, nor did Keith. It's Keith. So we're all, no, it's King's Cross. There we go. See, the brain comes back. So I'm standing with all these people, Nicky Hopkins, Bobby Keys, Jim Price. I guess Bill Wyman was there. Charlie was there. Must have been standing next to Charlie. I knew who they were. And down the platform comes a guy in a British Rail uniform. Okay. Hello, Charlie. Charlie's father, who worked his entire life for British Rail. He leaving. And I don't know if Charlie's father knew or that's where he worked in King's Cross. And I thought, I'm not in America anymore. You know what I mean? And they were so English with one another, you know, polite. They didn't hug, they didn't shake hands, and have a good tour. And his father kept walking. So that tour was so different from the 72 tour.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, you said
they
they were
we
playing. They said they were playing town halls. I mean, that was the last time they ever toured on
correct.
public transport. They were using commercial
Public,
planes.
you said it exactly. We got into a regular train in compartments, you know, and it was so small. That's the point. And there was no pressure. People were so happy to see them. They were so accepted by the people who came to see them. You know, when they would eat in these restaurants, and the waitress was so, oh, you know what? They also never ordered anything that was on the menu. One of the first lessons I learned touring with the Stones, you just tell them what you'd like to eat, and if you're with the Stones, they'll make it for you. Okay, so you know, and I've also said this. We could talk about that tour in more detail if you want, but my thing back then was to never let people see me taking notes. Okay. I didn't record anything. I just wrote on my pad. But in order to do that, I had to go to the loo. Okay. I could close the door and also referred to as the bog occasionally back then.
Still,
What?
it still is.
Still, I don't know, but I want to say I was in some of the foulest bathrooms in the history of Western civilization back
Well, if you're
then.
on British trains, that tends to be the
You know
case.
exactly what I'm talking about. That's the way. Even in the town hall, since it was awful. You know, we played Green's Theatre in Glasgow. That I don't know, it was 190,000 years old, and you know you could hardly see in the hallways. It was another England, and it was the end of that era, I believe. As Keith said, because the tour began in Newcastle and then it went to Manchester. He didn't say it to me, but he said, not that much here has changed since the end of World War II. It
Yeah.
looked that way. There was no money. There was depression and people struggling to get it, you know, to survive. And somehow, I mean, these shows were incredible, I must say, you know, one after another. And two a night, they did a full set, you know, but to
Hmm.
see them, and again, by that point, I'd seen a lot of rock and roll and a lot of music, you know, in a lot of different venues. To be on the stage in the wing, standing behind Chip Monk, who was standing behind Nicky Hopkins at the piano, and sometimes Stu, who'd play on the honky tonk stuff. Oh my God, you know, Mick Taylor, Keith was incredible, and Mick, you know, throwing himself around the stage, and Midnight Rambler, you know, standing ovation every night. They came back once to do an encore, I think. I don't think it was Johnny, it was Go Johnny Go, I think, Chuck Berry. So it was a, you know, peak experience for me. And the only, again, back to the real nature of rock and roll. So the tour ended at the Roundhouse in London. They did two shows, and backstage was like star heaven that night, man. It's like you had to be somebody to get backstage that night. Dave Mason, the creme de la creme at that point. And this is Mick, for reasons known only to him. We are between shows. I'm just minding my own business. All my stories start like that. And Mick comes over to me and says, "You have no idea what we've been doing." I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Yeah, you haven't seen a fucking, you haven't taken a fucking note, mate. And like, you've been as stoned as anybody on this tour." I can't deny that. It's like, fortunately, it wasn't anything beyond the ordinary. And I was so stunned, I didn't say anything. What was I going to say? I got so many pages of notes, I've got a notebook. But then when the article came out, that was the entree into the further world of the Rolling Stones, because they liked what I wrote and well, there was nothing not to write. I didn't have to protect them because they had been public figures for so long that, especially Keith, incredibly skilled at the art of deception. I didn't know Keith was loaded on heroin on that tour. They didn't shoot up in anywhere where you could see them. They knew how to get away with stuff. And, the story opens with us flying back from Glasgow on what was then BEA, British something Airlines. And, they brought this little dog on the plane, and the stewardess tried, and Keith went off. You know what I mean? He just did one of the great Keith performances of all time. And, there was a lot of small moments. I think it could have been, no, we were in Brighton at, what the name of that awful disco, huge place. And we were downstairs, and this is, cardinal sin. We're all together traveling as a group. We get there and the dressing room is locked. Excuse me? Rolling Stones are here to play your lousy venue. And it's, England in March back then, it's freezing.
Yeah.
And Keith, again, classic rant about Marlon. Marlon coughs. My son, he makes it sound like his child is about to come down with whooping cough or diphtheria because they have to stand in the hall. And the next thing, and I cannot explain this to you, except my background in Brooklyn, I guess, Keith and I are unscrewing the door. He's got his knife, which he doesn't, and I've got like a Swiss Army knife, which has and the two of us, we don't talk. I have not spoken a word to him yet on the tour. This is in the middle, close to the end. I don't know if he knows who I am. It doesn't matter who I am. We're going to get in the dressing room, okay? And with big, heavy door, and we get the latches off, and he basically I'm still not, I'm still scared of everything. And he throws the door in the hallway, and then they all pour into the dressing room, which of course is heated. And then like 10 minutes later, here comes the promoter, and everybody looks at each other like, did somebody throw that door in the hallway? I can't imagine who that could have been. And last thing on this memoir trip here, Graham Parsons is on tour, okay, with Keith. And God love him, and I love his music. And he was a sweetheart. He was so loaded, so out of it, And so I don't think it was Keith. Somebody says to me at that same gig, "Bob, can you get Graham to the stage?" Because when you're with them, you're a roadie. Doesn't matter who you are. You're going to be asked to do stuff. And if you don't, then you're not one of them. I said, "Yeah, no problem." Okay. I said, "Graham, come on. We're going up to the stage." Oh, okay. So we go through these double doors, and I have a worse sense of direction. I can get lost in my own house, and I often have. So we go up through these doors, and we get up a flight, double flight. We get to the next door, it's locked. Okay, well, we keep going. And Graham will go up and around and around. And, Graham is starting to lose it. Because for him, this is probably like a day. You know what I mean? His sense of time is completely. Finally, we get to a door. I said, "Graham, no problem. We're here, man. Good." I open the door, and he and I step out. And we are standing in the balcony of a darkened, empty movie theater. And before us on a huge screen is Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, which is an awful movie, a sequence to Valley of the Dolls. And Graham turns and looks at me, and his eyes are huge now. He's not pinned anymore. It's like, well, he can't speak, and all I can do is say, "Hey, I'm really sorry, man. This is not where we want to go." And I walk him all the way back down, and somehow we find the stage. And he didn't rat me out. I don't think they would have thrown me off the tour, but I've never forgotten that because I exposed him to this nightmare journey, which he probably forgot 2 minutes later. Okay, so different tour, really different. Okay,
You mentioned that the Stones must have liked your piece. I mean, the piece that ran in Rolling Stone is brilliant. It's so evocative, and you really
thank you.
focus on the minutiae of touring life. I want to ask you about your kind of writing process, your methods. You mentioned that you were kind of taking notes in secret, but all the dialogue is kind of perfect. You must have been writing everything down, and you're kind of following in the Tom Wolfe new journalism school, I suppose.
Simon, you got it exactly. I was, nobody who was a writer back then or a young writer could not have been influenced by Tom Wolfe. Kool-Aid, the electric Kool-Aid acid test is so formative in the way he approached journalism by becoming part of the scene. And he could do it. I mean, he was such a individualistic, wearing white suits, and he wasn't like a guy who could blend into the background. He was a star, and he knew he was a star, and he deserved to be a star. He did a great piece about surfers in Laguna Beach, and they accepted him. And what he did was listen, you know. And I think, in retrospect, I don't know if people know how to do that anymore. Journalists, like, really listen. And the way that they spoke to one another, the Stones, I mean, Charlie could be hysterically, they all could be hysterically funny,
Yeah.
actually, and so that was all from memory, but in the notebook. In other words, after 10 days on the road with them, it's not like I try to remember what they had said in Manchester. It was like I had written down what they had said in Manchester. I was so captured by the rhythm of the language because it was so different than in America. As I think about it now, talking to you, because I would have it basically because it was, four people worked in a Rolling Stone office in London then, on Newman Street, and because I was a stranger in a strange land, everything that I wrote about had made an impression on me that it would not have made on someone who had grown up there.
Yeah.
It was all so different. I'm going to throw in a plug. I think that's part of the business we're both in. So if
Absolutely.
anybody is interested in this era in London, in the music business, I have written a novel. I've also written novels. That's called Rain Gray Town, which is a line from The Byrds, 8 Miles High. Rain Gray Town is available on Kindle. And if anybody who will be listening to this podcast would like to know what it's about, a bass player and his band and what happens to them. And, all of it is based on what I experienced being there back then, an era that will certainly not come again. So, there it is. That's the only plug. Okay.
The Stones obviously liked what they read, if they
Yeah.
read it or if they were told they read it, because
Oh, no, they were.
the next thing you know, you're being invited to Nellcôte, which was Keith's villa in the south of
Yeah.
France, where they're recording Exile on Main Street. So you sat him down for what was literally his most extensive interview to date. He really hadn't
Thank you.
spoken in that depth to anyone before. So
Okay, Simon, you really understand all this perfectly. So that came about because of Marshall Chess, son of,
Leonard Chess.
Leonard Chess, nephew of Phil Chess. I mean, again, think about the world back then and how small it was. When Marshall was 15 or 16, he would get uh, mail from someone in London, along with some kind of international check, CHEUQE,
Yeah.
to pay for blues albums, and he would ship them to Michael Philip Jagger. That if you wanted to hear the blues, you had to write someone. Marshall would wrap and take the albums to the post office, and then wound up managing the band. So Marshall and I got along famously. He was hysterically funny, really smart. I mean, who could have known more about this music than Marshall, who grew up with it? And so he arranged this with Jan Wenner. Marshall and Jan Wenner were friendly. And the thing I will say, and you must believe me, I was never aware, and it happened frequently, that on some level, Rolling Stone, of course, being the voice of that generation, and I were, and this is the only case where it was with the Stones. And then they were more, well, Marshall was more than gracious to pay me back. The interview was all about selling the album. Okay.
Yeah.
It's all about Sticky Fingers with Ahmet, who was very close to Jan. I didn't think like that. I was just writing and wanted to write. And so I was in Cannes, hello, at the Cannes Film Festival. I wrote an article about El Topo, a movie made by Alejandro Jodorowsky, which became a cult movie in New York, and kind of an astonishing piece of work. And I got a cable, I think, or a phone call. I didn't have a cell phone. I don't know. Andrew Bailey could not have called me from London. We weren't emailing. When you
No.
think back and try, yeah, Pony Express. I don't know how he got in touch with me, but instructing me to go. Bob, you're going to do the Rolling Stone interview with Keith Richards. There's a big. That's the cover. Whoa. I mean, I had been writing for months and I couldn't get anything into the back of the magazine. My stuff was always in the front where the brief articles were 2,000 words, one page. So I saw this as an amazing, step forward in my quote unquote career. And, I don't know if any of this is amusing or not, but I had gotten to the film festival late and I had a rent-a-car waiting for me that I had not arranged. And the only thing left then was like something out of James Bond. It wasn't an Aston Martin, but well, it had a stick shift, and I had never in New York, you didn't drive a stick shift
No.
unless you were delivering stuff from a truck. Okay. I got to get to the hotel, where I stayed in the friend's room. I didn't even have my own room. I got there somehow. I don't remember. But now I'm driving from Cannes to Villafrance on the Corniche, which is again like a racing course. And man, I am doing really badly. Like I am stalling out at intersections. Gendarmes are waving me through, and I can't get the car to start. I stalled it, and the French, they're so lovely. You know, they're giving me the French finger. I spoke French, passively. They're insulting my mother in French. Okay. Calling me it's nothing I can do, man. I'm soaked in sweat. What do you want from me? Trying to drive this car that I don't understand. I get there, the gates, it's so imposing. Not like you're going to a bungalow, it's an incredible mansion, which then was surrounded by a jungle of trees. So, I'm terrified already. It's like, what the hey? I still have never spoken to Keith. We have not exchanged a single word. Okay. I walk up to the front door. I knock on the front door, and he had a woman there. And oh, Monsieur Keith, she says. And she closes the door and vanishes. Okay, fine. She's going to go find him. I guess I gave her my name, And the door opens, and here's Keith in all his splendor, And he said, oh, man, Bob Greenfield. I think he hugs me. Like, this is the cardinal moment. It's like, what? I have been accepted. The king has acknowledged that I am alive, And he lays it all out. He knows about it. They set it up with him. I sent him at the festival. Come back in a few days, man. We'll get all this together. Okay, so I finish what I was doing at Cannes and I come back. I don't know I'm going to live there. I don't know anything. And I'll just keep going on this. And so before I left the festival, a guy from New York, who was a publicity guy who was going back to America, didn't want to be holding, as we would say in the day, carrying, gave me a little box with what were they called? Temple balls. They were very potent hash, from Nepal, Nepalese, who knows? Okay, I mean, I wasn't thinking. I put it in always had a satchel, with London. Andrew always had a satchel. You could put your tape recorder in the satchel. I come back to Nellcôte, and now all of a sudden, the party is in progress. The endless party that would endure for the next 2 weeks, where people came and you didn't know anybody's last name, and they would leave, and there'd be 14, 16 people at lunch for 3.5 hours. And, at one point late at night, I think, because I sometimes would be up by myself downstairs, and Anita I never went upstairs in Nellcôte. Those were the private rooms where all the private stuff happened. Had my own room downstairs, which was incredible. Anita kind of just in passing said to me in that incredible accent of hers, why is it that no one ever says goodbye? Hello? They would just leave, man, and come back and leave again. Stash was there. Tommy Weber was there. His sons, Jake and Charlie, Jake Weber, who became a well-known actor in America. And all these people are sitting around a table. Keith, of course, is at the head of the table, and this is unfathomable. He says to me, "Do I have anything to smoke? We've run out." Hello? I, I reach in the satchel. I slide it down to him. It's like King Arthur, the round table, except this was a long table. He looks at it, man. He's, you know what I mean? Could not have given him a better gift. And, again, this is ancient history. Those who are not alive then, most of them, trying to learn how to roll a 5-paper English joint back then, where you had to glue the papers together. You would tear the cardboard strip off a Rizla as a filter.
Yeah.
And then there's tobacco and hash. You have to melt the hash in it. I mean, could anything be more toxic than smoking hash in tobacco and inhaling deeply? You would have gotten high from the tobacco. And Keith rolled, of course, perfect joints, So that was kind of like, oh, Bob, you're okay. You can stay here for 2 weeks. I didn't have anything else on me. And I was very lucky. I've always referred to it as the garden period. They weren't recording yet. The truck arrived and they parked it outside the mansion. And so it started off great. I have a photograph of myself and Keith sitting on the back steps. I'm interviewing him. He's holding a spliff in his hand that he rolled, talked at length, and he was incredible. Right. Point being, and you said it, no one had ever heard Keith say anything before. Literally.
Yeah.
It was always Mick. And right from the go, Keith was anything you want to ask me, I'm going to tell you. It was so plainly outspoken and incredible to talk to. First session was great. And then, Keith, the endless party. I don't know how long, days would go by when I couldn't get him to talk to me, but we did amazing things. Took me out in the speedboat of his, which he had renamed Mandrax. I wonder why, And I've just gone through this with somebody who was not there back then, but they also had a rabbit there. I'm just rambling here. The rabbit's name was Boots, Boots, which was, I don't know if it's still in England, was a pharmacy.
Chemist. Yeah, yeah.
A chemist, forgive me. And so, okay, so the cute rabbit name is Boot. Well, the story behind it, there always is one. When Keith was writing a lot of the stuff, when he was up in the country, I don't know if it was at the big man, I don't know where he was, but he had a couple who were registered heroin addicts because you could do that then, legal. You could register legally. And I wrote an article about this called Junk Time in Piccadilly on Monday night at midnight. The Boots there must have been open 24 hours a day and night. They would line up outside and they would be given what were called jacks, Jacks, jacks of heroin. And many of them would go immediately into the public urinal by the park and shoot up. Others would sell them, okay, to other people. They didn't need as much as they'd been given. And so this couple would come down from where Keith was. Both of them probably were registered. Then they would go back up, and that's how Keith was scoring. And that's why he named the rabbit Boots. You can't make it up. Okay.
Well, let's skip forward because
Okay.
the next time your path crossed with the Stones was when you were invited to accompany them on the 1972 tour of
Well,
America.
that's an interesting story too, and I'm just going to tell one more quick one about the end. So I spent 2 weeks there. We talked. Oh, I had to call Marshall Chess. Marshall, I can't stay here. You have to tell Keith we need to finish. Marshall flew in, sat at the table, made Keith finish the interview. Then I go off and I spend a week transcribing it. It was almost 100 pages long.
Yeah,
There was back and forth and on a pretty good tape recorder. Well, I'm going to show it to him because, I don't know. I want him to want him to sign off on it, and it's all good and I got it right. Any mistakes? And I show up, Keith, I need you to read the interview. Okay. He takes me in the kitchen and he's standing by the sink counter and a pile of, typed papers, the original, not the carbon, a carbon copy, no less, something no one knows about it anymore. And he starts reading, he's smoking incessantly, one after another. And as he finishes each page, he tosses it to the side. Some are on the floor. So nothing worse than watching someone read what you've written in front of you,
no.
especially if it's Keith Richards. It took a while, man, because he effing read it. He paid attention, gets to the last page, looks up, looks at me, and says, "I said it, man. Print it."
That's
It's
it.
like out of a movie. Yeah, the
Agree.
best. So now we go into more of the Sturm und Drang, the stuff behind the scenes. I was never part of the chosen circle around Jan Wenner. He had his people in San Francisco. I was working in London. Come there and see him maybe once a year for the Rolling Stone Editors Conference. Just the way it was back then. And I was also, gee, this is a shock. Semi uncontrollable. I wanted to do what I wanted to do. I wanted to write what I wanted to write. We would get cables in London from Jan saying, "What about the Bay City Rollers?" Andrew and I would be laughing, saying, "Yeah, what about them?" We are not going to, no offense to the Bay City Rollers, but Jan was trying to stay hip and stay up with what he thought was hot in London. Well, so point being, Jan did not want me on the tour. He absolutely. And Marshall Chess, once again, said, "Jan, Bob Greenfield or nobody." Because by that point, well, once the interview came out, it confirmed that I don't know what, I was acceptable on it. How can I know what it confirmed? They trusted me. That's what I could say for certain. And so Marshall persuaded Jan to put me on the tour. And again, the things you remember. They had a publishing company, Straight Hour Press. All I wanted to do was write books. I went down to the guy who ran it. I'm not going to name him. Explained what this. No, no, no. They were. We couldn't have. No, we're not going to do that. Didn't have it. I mean, I'm one of your people. This is the Rolling Stones. You're not interested. So that was a blow, but never mind. So now back again in terms of, well, they knew who I was this time. The difference is insane. The private jet, the black limos, never leaving from a gate at any airport where anybody else can get within 5,000 yards, The press on the tour, unlike I was, or sometimes they'd be on the plane, the pressure, every city they played in, and you must believe me, they were front page news in that city. The Rolling Stones come to, yeah, wherever they went, and it was a military operation of major proportions. It was all arenas, Okay, having said that, they were still playing their asses off. And it's really, as the great Bill Graham, I wrote his book with him as well, said to me once, as only Bill could say, "You know what, Bob? If they weren't any good anymore, nobody would want to come see them." And then at that same point or later, I said to Marshall Chess, "Marshall, what is it? When are they going to stop? Why do they keep doing this?" And he said to me, "Bob, it's the only time they really feel alive because the money is no longer a factor. This is what they need to do in order to justify what they do and their own existence. So the shows were still but it was so different. And I mean, for me, the highlight was they did a 3 song acoustic set in the middle of the show on another stage, small stage. Mick, I think just singing. I could be wrong. He might have had a guitar. Mick Taylor and Keith acoustic guitars. And they did I think a California song. Got to get that blank out, your shoes. You know what song I'm
Sweet
thinking of?
Virginia.
Yeah, Sweet, thank you. Sweet Virginia. They did the Robert Johnson song,
Love in Vain.
Love and Vain. Good for God, man. You should. I need you in my office, Simon. Yeah, and one other one, and the arena would be dead silent. Like that's how good they were. Keith and Mick Taylor and Mick. I mean, they were stunning. That's what's hard to explain, the impact of their ability and talent. Before the tour began, they were at SIR, which is Studio Instrument Rentals, on Sunset Boulevard, rehearsing. Little Feat were in the next studio. I didn't get in there. And they were playing on pig nose, tiny amps. Charlie may have just had like not even a full drum kit. And the place was like a suburban basement with a very low ceiling. To hear the music like that, you get it. No frills, no amp, no real amps. That's something you can't explain,
Yeah.
and no one has ever been able to replicate. How astonishingly great they are.
You've talked about all the differences between the tour you were on the year before and this one, but this was coming 3 years after the last time they were in America. The last time they were in America
So,
was, of course, Altamont,
ultimate,
which
yeah,
was just soaked in death and destruction, and
yeah,
they're kind of
yeah.
blamed for the death of the '60s. So they had a lot to
No,
prove.
absolutely, absolutely.
Did the energy feel different? Was there pressure on them to come back and prove themselves?
Well, it was definitely their rehabilitation tour. Ahmet knew this. Marshall knew it. They had to do this. It was also the tour where they crossed over to older generations. They became a mainstream show business attraction. Okay.
Yeah,
As well as the greatest rock and roll band in the world, as Sam Cutler called them when he introduced them that way for the first time. But the energy, and it's a great question. It was a crazy time. Bowie had started. Mick was, of course, imitating Bowie with the diaphanous nightgown, spangled, that he wore on stage. Mick always took from whatever was going on around him, which is part of the genius. I mean, there were, in Minnesota, there were like young boys wearing dresses. I hadn't seen that. It was an era of transition, which some could say began in the basement at Nellcôte. By that album, which didn't get raved about, and I talked about this all the time, wasn't acknowledged as a great, it confused people. There
hmm
was so much music on it. There was so many different kinds of music on it. You can hear Graham Parsons' influence clearly in all the country stuff because, they were having trouble recording and Graham showed up. Keith was playing more every day with Graham on the back veranda than he was downstairs in the basement, being Keith. I mean, the greatness of all of it then was how what am I trying to say? Uncontrolled, chaotic, and insane their process was.
yeah.
Like they'd go to the studio, the jamming, and it wasn't like they were efficient. You know what I mean? And then I was with them before the tour when they were mixing it in LA, and they were still crazed. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, I've said this in print, I think. It's an album that was recorded under the influence of heroin and mixed under the influence of cocaine.
Hmm.
So I don't know when you get what you get when you mix the two of them together, but now it has become revered. This is
Yeah.
the peak of their work. So
So the copy that you ended up writing from this tour, I mean, it's so evocative. It reeks of that time, the chaos that you were talking about, but it plays out like a movie. It really is kind of the
thank
way that
you.
you write about it, and the cast of characters in it are all just so diverse, and each of them stands out brilliantly in the book. So I want to name some of the key players in your book, and I want you to give a little line or two about each, as if
I will.
describing their character. First of all, Peter Rudge.
I still correspond with Rudge. I mean, it was hard not to love Rudge. He was so manic. He was so involved down to the smallest detail. He drove everybody crazy, but in a great way. He was really good at what he did.
And his role was?
Well, he was a tour manager. He had taken out the Who. He came from the Who, and they had never had anyone like this. Peter was a force of nature. And he and I were hanging on the corrugated door in Vancouver when the revolutionaries stormed the backstage area and were trying to get in, and God knows what they would have done. And Rudge was furious because his security people were nowhere to be found. And the gate is going up, and we're terrified. Like, man, we're going to be the first ones they eat. But fortunately, we managed to keep out the insurgents. Go ahead.
What about Chipmunk?
And Monk, these are all incredible characters. Chipmunk began at the Village Gate, in Greenwich Village, lighting director. Brilliant at what he did. He he designed a set for this tour, two of them. They needed two so that the truck could go to the next gig and set it up. That's how big the stage was. It was immense. Before the tour, it was laid out on the floor of a sound stage at Warner Brothers Films in Burbank. It was a dragon, incredibly beautiful. Mr. Special Effects. Chip would stand by the piano next to it, and he would call the light cues during the show. He was the best at that, I would think. I mean, everybody who came later, the great lighting directors, and there are many of them, some with the Grateful Dead. Chip, well, if you see Monterey Pop, at one point, I don't remember who's on stage, everything goes purple because Chip had recently ingested some Owsley purple acid and like put the sliders on purple and just stood there, watched the rest of the concert. But he again was everything about them was state of the art. They had the best people.
What about Joe Bergman? What was she like?
She was like a mom. She was really a mom, and and this is unusual. Not everybody who worked with them and for them had a relationship with all of the Stones. They're five separate people,
Yeah.
different. And Joe could talk to all of them because for a long time in London, it was Joe Bergman and Alan Dunn. Alan had always been Mick's guy and remained that. And Joe ran the office, and she was also incredibly good at what she did. I mean, she was the one who just allowed me to get in there and somehow got what I wanted to do because I'd said to her, look, I just want to be there and hang out. I'm not going to, I never asked them questions. And so very skilled at what she did. She went on to become a vice president at Warner Brothers Records and a sweet, sweet human being.
Robert Frank, who was filming the tour, seems to come across in the book as a bit of an outsider. Was that the case?
Well, Robert was a great artist. Okay. His book of photographs, The Americans, is iconic and
Of course, yeah.
won some great award. And also a very early independent filmmaker, Pull My Daisy, worked with Allen Ginsberg, worked with Sam Shepard. Robert was the real deal. He had the loft in Lower Manhattan. And may he rest in peace. Robert could be really difficult. Okay. Came from another generation, came from the Beatniks, and had a pretty bad time on the tour. Didn't like it, didn't love it. Filmed it all. I mean, leave it to Mick. Mick had chosen the wall of photographs for the cover of Exile that he'd seen in a barber shop on Main Street in Los Angeles. I think Robert's photographs were in it. He knew Robert's reputation. Mick always knew about artists and who was, you know, somebody famous. Warhol did the Sticky Fingers, cover. Again, rock and roll not usually accessing people like that in that era. I'm not going to name it, I mean, I've cursed enough. I don't have to name it. Everybody knows the name of it, Blank Blank Blues. There are some incredible scenes in it. He didn't want to make it coherent record of the tour, but there's also stuff that is staged. When those
Yeah.
quote unquote groupies come on the plane, that's not real. They brought them on, they knew what they were doing. All documentaries seem, not all, in which people are playing the parts that they've been asked to play.
Yeah.
Okay. But no, when I talked to him, he was not happy, and the tour was over. The interesting thing, he worked with Danny Seymour, a very gifted, who was a cameraman as well. And this is what we're talking about. We haven't talked about the toll, TOLL, extracted uh, uh, from people who were around the Stones. He was using Danny, a very lovely human as well. And after the tour, he got on a boat. He had a sailboat, and they never found him. So casualty.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's touch on your encounters with the Stones themselves. With regards to chaos and decadence that followed the Stones around, you wrote that Mick Taylor was very much a tourist in the midst of it all. That's your words. He was only 22 at the time, so how do you think
Right.
he reacted to being exposed to the wildest aspects of touring America?
Well, he wasn't exposed to them. See, um, again, I said this before. Mick, one of the sweeter people I've ever met in rock and roll, didn't speak much at all. He was there with Rose, and she was called Rose Taylor, but they weren't literally married. They had a young daughter named Chloe, who was on the tour. Um, I just want to say for the record, I've seen a lot of people play. I've been fortunate. On a nightly basis, Mick Taylor was as good as anybody I've ever seen. I mean, he had replaced Peter Green in John Mayall's Blues Breakers. Again, give Mick credit, and Keith would have consulted. When they told Brian Jones that he wasn't in the band anymore, and Brian had earned that by being so messed up for so long and difficult. And I thought about this today. They went in a completely different direction. You know what I mean? They went Clapton wise. And Mick changed the nature of the Rolling Stones in ways that people I don't think really understand. Can't you hear me knocking? That's Mick Taylor sounding like Carlos Santana and just playing beautiful stuff. He contributed to so many of their songs, and the great irony is this is the Rolling Stones as well. The one song on which he receives songwriting credits, because he wrote the music and Mick wrote the lyrics, is Ventilator Blues, which is on Exile, was recorded in the basement where there was a ventilator because you couldn't breathe. It was so hot and so humid. I always thought that he left because he was so insulted. It's so ironic. He contributed so much more to so many. They never gave him a penny in songwriting credits until an obscure cut on an album. You get my point. Very Stone.
In describing Charlie Watts, you claimed he possesses a childlike innocence that is beautiful. What did you mean by that? What was it like to be hanging around Charlie?
Without question, the most lovable of the Rolling Stones. So incredibly unassuming. He kept that band together. Everybody loved Charlie in the band. Keith followed Charlie on stage. And I mean, Charlie could take the piss, as they used to say. I remember him on the English tour in the lobby. I came down to the lobby, and here was Mick, circled by media. BBC was there. They were shooting him. And Charlie, God love him, was like bent over, and he was making his way around the outside of the circle saying, "Who is that? Is that someone famous? Do we know him?" And Jagger saw him and he could not laugh. Charlie he had the gravitas to get away with that stuff. Uh, we were in Dallas. You say we. I wasn't playing, but we were there. And it was a big deal because Jack Kennedy had been killed there. And though it was a long time afterwards, that's what it still stank from. And individually, everybody went to Dealey Plaza to look at it. It was that. And so and one night I came down to the lobby. Charlie was standing there by himself, you know what I mean? Which is shocking. And Annie Leibovitz was there, and Annie was fabulous on the tour. I mean, so, and Annie Leibovitz and Charlie Watts and I wound up going out for pizza some college joint. We drank beer. Nobody knew who he was, and Charlie was delighted. Like this was great by him, like to not be driven crazy by people. But the other great one for me with Charlie is so by that point, and I'll tell you why, I was no, I quit. I quit. Yeah, I left Rolling Stone in the middle of the tour for good reason. But I was filing from the road somehow. Mojo Wire. I think so. Yeah, that's what they called it. Early version of the fax, of a fax. And the way the Stones would leave the gig every night while people were still up and cheering and hoping for an encore, they had like a camper, like a really bourgeois, middle class. You go to Yosemite, you see a camper,
Yeah.
and they would run off stage, get into the camper, and the camper would leave the arena. Well, Stones can't be in a camper. They're in black limos. We're the limo. And it worked. It got them out of there every night, but it was always parked, uh, you know, behind the stage in these vast arenas. And so one night before they go on, I'm sitting there. We had a little portable typewriter, and I'm writing and I'm focusing. And all of a sudden I realize someone is looking at me from the window. I'm sitting in front of a window, and it's Charlie. And the great thing, I mean, all of them, like, Mick had terrible stage fright. You didn't talk to him before a show, but Charlie would be so wired. He couldn't sit down before a show, and he would walk around twirling his drumsticks and he was incredible at it. It's like watching somebody do juggle or something.
Yeah.
He's out there twirling the sticks, and I look up, say, "Hey, Charlie," and he said, "Are you doing your sums? Is this your homework?" I said, "Charlie, I'm trying to file copy." "Oh, okay. I'll see you later." And he just strolled off, and that's what he was like. He was really, really, and was such a jazz fanatico. That was the music he loved. And at the end of the tour, I gave him a copy of Charlie Mingus's book, Beneath the Underdog. And I
Yeah.
said, "Charlie, I know you want to read this. You're going to like it." Very civilized.
So I want to ask you about Jagger now. He is clearly, by reading your book, the man who's in charge of everything. He's the one that everybody defers to for decisions. He's the
Yeah,
ringmaster of this
yeah,
circus. So from
yeah.
your kind of position where you could see him in charge of everything, how do you think he dealt with all the stress that was on his shoulders and all the responsibilities?
Well, I mean, the best way to say that is at the end of the tour was in New York. They played Madison Square Garden, did two shows one day, did two more shows, I think, at night. They were pretty good. And New York always deranges everybody, especially after you've been on a road for that long. And he was interviewed by Dick Cavett, who was a late night talk show host, very smart, very good at what he did. And Cavett asked Mick, like, "What do you weigh now?" And Mick, of course, gave the physician, like 14 kilos. I mean, he looked like a bone by the end of the tour. Okay. And he really, he's an athlete. People don't understand that. His father, Joe, was a physical fitness instructor at a school. Mick ran. So he was in great shape. And again, to go back to the English tour, you could not get off the elevator on the floor where the Stones were staying. That's what the security was like because they were afraid that the Hells Angels were going to come after them. They had been served with lawsuits by a variety of people. There was a fear that Mick talked about it before, that someone would try to assassinate him.
Hmm.
They weren't checking people for weapons when they came into the arenas then. So the security was warranted, and they had these two great guys, both of whom had been two black guys who had been policemen, to run the security operation, but you were in a bubble. That's what it resulted in. All that mattered was where you were, where you're going to go next. You didn't have to work. You brought your suitcase down in the morning, you put it in the lobby, and then you were miraculously transported to wherever they were going next. But that didn't help Mick. I mean, he was able to deal with it.
Yeah.
But it's not like he didn't look like he needed to go somewhere and recover when the
Yeah.
tour ended. Okay. Yeah.
So, unlike many of the people that pop up in your book, the boys and the girls, you had a purpose on the tour. You were there for a reason and you were there at their invitation. But still, it seemed like there were tiers to the touring party. You know, Mick and Keith were the upper level and everyone else was on their different positions. Um, there's a story that you tell about when the cars come to pick up the group to take you to an Isley Brothers concert, and some people get left behind. So there was obviously a tiered system to the people that were on the tour. Did that affect your behavior and how you behaved around the Stones, knowing that any wrong move would immediately render you uncool?
You know, the first thing you said is so deep and important. I would say well, it's who I was as well, but I was always working when I was with them. I wasn't hanging out. I wasn't trying to be one of them. You know, they all knew you know, maybe I got respect for that. You know, I had written, but to answer the last part of the question, by that point in time, I had written enough about them that, I mean, I'm sure it would have been very hard for me to get myself thrown off that toward the other point, and it's a real point. By then, and maybe I always knew from the beginning, I knew how to behave around them, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, first tour, I never talked. I mean, I wasn't frightened. If you said hello to me, I said hello to you. But by then, I was trusted. And then, I mean, again, if we're talking about process, once the tour ended and somebody offered me a book contract from out of the blue for what I always refer to as a mid four-figure advance. Okay, think
Hmm.
about that. You know, so I mean, as far as I knew, I was done. Oh, so Jan had promised me the world. You're going to run all your cover, and I sent all this copy in, and you cut it to shreds, and he had a whole issue full of Annie's photographs, which were great. And he had also hired Truman Capote, no less, who appeared in New Orleans. He wanted him to write about the tour. Well, bro, if you're going to choose between Truman and me, I know, and he never wrote anything, and he was a disaster, caused a lot of chaos on the tour. Keith hated him, you know, on and on and on, the whole 9 yards. But I quit. I quit. I said, Jan, you know, you can't lie to people. That's how young I was.
Hmm.
I've learned otherwise. And then from out of the blue came this offer in a letter, of course, to write the book. And then I came back for New York and those shows. But afterwards, just to let you know, I think it's all about how you do these things. Um, I spent months. I went to San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, London, interviewing everybody I could, everybody, like
Yeah.
the security guys, everybody. And then, of course, the Stones, you know, why would they be in London? They were in Kingston, Jamaica, quote unquote, recording Goat's Head Soup. And this is when the, Jamaica was at war. Trenchtown, you know, we went one night to the studio, uh, very famous studio run by a very famous guy, and they rushed us in, slammed the door behind us, and there were bullet holes in the walls. And it was frightening, scary to be there. So I spent months interviewing on top of everything I had from the tour. And then I went off and wrote the book, you
Yeah.
know, and I'm going to say this facetiously, and the rest is history.
Well,
In the worst sense, you know, what?
I just want to circle back quickly to the last date of the tour. Your story in the book builds up to its climax, which is in New York City. Now,
Right.
to me, when I think of New York in 1972, I'm
Oh,
imagining the streets of the French Connection, Shaft, Superfly, Panic at
yeah,
Needle Park. It seems
yeah.
seedy, dangerous, gritty, and yet the Stones get there and they're bored. Keith Richards is sleeping 14 hours a day. They're absolutely burnt out from
Well,
2 months of
Simon,
touring.
they also can't leave the hotel. That's another reason because of exactly what you said. Again, in my mind, in my memory, another iconic moment. I'm from New York, okay? But
Yeah.
New York is heading for the pit at that point. It's close to the worst it's ever been and going to be, like really desperate time. Um, and I stayed in the worst hotel in the history of America, you know, because I came there at the last minute, awful place, blazingly hot, you know. And I don't even know if it was at night. I might have been walking to the garden and I saw two taxi cabs There was a red light. First taxi cab stopped. Second one slammed into the back of it. Both drivers got out. They punched each other. The light changed and they took off. I thought, welcome to New York. Okay, you're
Welcome
here.
home.
Welcome home. We're glad to see you, Bob. Yeah.
But was that burnout actually tangible across the span of the tour? Could you see them just fraying at the edges?
No, no, that's a great question. No, which again speaks to why they've endured. Okay. I tell people this one too. Unlike the Beatles, the Rolling Stones began in a VW bus with Ian Stewart driving, playing one show, driving all night, playing. They began as a touring band. Beatles didn't. And so they had learned how to live on the road and they were accustomed to the lifestyle. They weren't that old then. I mean, Jagger was like, what, 26th birthday, 20, I don't know, I can't remember his birthday, no offense, although it was in July 26th, I think. Just here we come. But they were able to withstand it, and for Wyman and Charlie and Mick Taylor, it was a radically different tour because they weren't getting loaded, on a level that Mick and Keith were separately always in private rooms where you couldn't go, a private room in the dressing room where you couldn't go. And if you see that movie by Robert Frank, the great shot is Keith slowly nodding out as he sits on a bed. Well,
Yeah.
I guess you get one way to get some rest, but it's like I wouldn't recommend it personally.
When your book was finally released in 1974,
Yeah,
unbelievably, was only 1,500 copies of hardback and
you're unbelievable.
3,500 copies of paperback. It
Correct.
became a collector's item. It was
Correct.
famously one of the most stolen books from libraries. It became a
Correct.
cult classic, but it wasn't
Well, thank you.
republished for another 25 years. So why did it take so long for it to merit another tumbling of the dice, as it were?
Well done. Well played. I don't know. It didn't occur to me because in order to survive as a writer, you have to move on. So I
Hmm.
wasn't thinking about why won't somebody republish my Stones book. I was writing another book. And then after that, I was writing another book and I'm writing another book now. I can't explain that. It was published in England, hardback by Michael Joseph. It wasn't until Da Capo Press, which is now back as an imprint, and an editor there who I've worked with repeatedly. He was the one who republished it. And so, listen, everything old is new again. We're seeing this all the time now. You know, I'm not on the web. I'm not I don't publicize myself, but all these people who have been missing in action are being rediscovered, quote unquote. Well, if it's new for you, great, great. I think it's because it was the first. There was another book published a bit later by Bob Green, a guy in Chicago, about another tour. I don't know. It could have been, Alice. No, Alice Cooper. It could have been an Alice Cooper tour. I don't know. The market as it now exists doesn't exist, and if it's of interest, what we're dealing with now, and the only two bands I think who really, really, can make this claim are the Grateful Dead and the Rolling Stones. You're talking about three generations or more of people who are semi-obsessed with them. They're still working.
Yep.
That's one of the reasons. Um, it's really interesting. It can't be two more different bands than the Grateful Dead and the Rolling Stones, and yet they still have the most dedicated fan bases of any. Well, I guess the Beatles do, but you can't go see them.
So you've since returned to the Stones in your work. In 2006. You released Exile on Main Street, A Season in Hell with the Rolling Stones, and then again in 2014 came Ain't It Time We Said Goodbye, the Rolling
Right,
Stones on the Road to Exile. Is
right.
that your time with the Stones complete now? Is this a trilogy that you've come to the end of, or might you revisit them?
I never thought of it as a trilogy. I mean, that's what's crazy. So, I wrote three books about the Stones. Oh, I've written three books about the Grateful Dead and people associated with them. I didn't set out to write. They're all separate. You know what I mean? They're all one-offs, which is, I realized how it's such that summer. I think the Exile book is the interpersonal drama is insane. Okay. The melodrama. And Anita is at the heart of that book,
Yeah.
and it's really about what goes on around her. And then eight at time we said goodbye was my goodbye at that point. It's never over. To the detail, how innocent and small and charming the first tour was. But, as never say never. And make me an offer.
Well, you have spent your life pretty much chronicling other people's lives. How do you think all of that has shaped your own? Like, who do you think you've become through telling other people's stories?
Uh, well, I've written a family memoir that no one seems interested in publishing, which I understand. I'm not as famous as someone whose memoir should be published. I take that judgment. I mean, what this has enabled me to do is escape into other worlds. I really like writing about other people. I like collaborating with other people. I did Burt Bacharach's book. There's a great artist, a
Yeah.
great gentleman. I did John Barlow's book, brilliant human being, internet pioneer, really good lyricist for the Grateful Dead. I didn't do Owsley Stanley's book with him, but I don't know. I just, as a journalist, you're trained to write about other people, and I was trained. Oh, they might not agree that it was a successful training. I mean, they didn't get me at all at that school. And, I was definitely the outlier and like writing about stuff they'd never heard of. But I've gotten away with it. That's all I can say. They haven't come for me yet. I'm okay. So,
And you still don't have a real job.
you know what? I worked. Thank you, Simon. I take that as a compliment. I worked for a few months writing sports in New Jersey. Um, And that is so long ago that, I mean, if you're a writer, you can have a real job because you write, Bill Graham said the greatest thing is when your vocation is the way you can also earn a living. There's nothing better than that. And I'm very fortunate. This is all I've ever wanted to do. I'm happy to be doing it still. And I don't, how has it affected me? That's the real question. I have no idea, you know. I certainly hasn't made me a worse person. I got to see a lot of stuff. And often I think about how many people I often when they pass away. Oh, I interviewed him. Oh God, is she dead? We talked. And that would be the best. I mean, that's one of the greatest parts of doing this for a living is getting to meet people that you would never otherwise meet. And then the other thing, and I've said this when I do readings, is that at some point, not with the Stones, obviously, I had to stop going backstage because often these people who I revered musically were awful and they were far less than their music. And if you love the music, you don't want to ruin it by finding out, oh, that was the difference. Keith, Mick, they were bigger than their music. Bill was bigger than life. Maybe that's the difference now, that as you called them, these characters, they were incredible, especially for someone like me. I didn't have much in common with them, but they allowed me to talk to them and write about them. And so that was, I'm honored by all that. I really am.
Yeah, that's well you should be. Okay, let's wrap things up with five by
Well, now
five.
we're going to the lightning round, huh?
We are. You ready for this?
I hope so.
What is your favorite Rolling Stones song?
It might be Get Off My Cloud.
I think I might know the answer to this one, but what is your favorite Rolling Stones album?
It's not Exile. Absolutely not. I would say to you the three greatest back-to-back albums ever made are, and I'm going to mess up the titles, Let It Bleed, Lead It, and what was the one in the middle there before Sticky Fingers?
No, Let It Bleed was in the middle. Beggar's Banquet, Let It
Beggar's
Bleed.
Banquet, Let It Bleed, and Sticky Fingers. Those are the three. Those are my favorite. They're almost like one album.
What is a deep cut or underrated Stones track that you think deserves more love?
That's a really tough question. They would be on Exile. I hear them in Loving Cup, stuff like that. The real Graham Parsons one that I can't remember the title of. The stuff that doesn't get played. I mean, again, you got the silver. Keith. It's a great. Great. And then, what's behind it, this thing with Anita, a lot of meaning in that. Awful confession. It's not like I listen to the Stones on a regular basis anymore. And, when it comes on, if I'm on Spotify or something, um, I'll remember, oh, I remember that, where they played it, where I was, all that kind of stuff. But it's not what I listen to on Friday night. Okay.
In your opinion, what makes the Rolling Stones such an enduring and influential band?
Well, you know what? I think I've said it. I think it is absolutely the music and absolutely the intensity of the live performance. And if I go back to the English tour, Goodbye Great Britain, no backup singers, no backup musicians, just them. Keith singing harmony, could still sing back then. I don't know about now. You know, Nicky Hopkins on piano, incredible. Bobby Keys playing saxophone, Jim Price on trumpet, Charlie Bill Wyman, and that you could generate this kind of excitement in a hall. Okay, 2,500 people, so what? That they're all standing and dancing the English. Back then, these women of a certain age screaming, still screaming, you know, that's the power. That's what it's about. And it's not only that the music is recorded and great and eternal, it's back to Bill Graham. It's what they do on stage. The live act is what rules. Okay. That's why Bruce is still working. Okay?
Last one. If you could describe the Rolling Stones in just 3 words, what would they be?
Oh my God. 3 words. That's it. Oh
That
my,
works.
oh my God. What else can you say?
Well, thank you, Robert.
Hey, Simon, this has been a great pleasure. Your understanding of this world astonishes me. And I just would like to say well, you mentioned it, but I have not actually, again, to call it my career is pretentious even to me. I have not actually spent my entire career writing about just the Rolling Stones, although I'm proud to have written what I have about them. Okay?
Absolutely.
You be well. Take care.
That's us for now. Thank you for listening to Lip Service, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do me a favour and subscribe to our podcast, like or comment to give us a helping hand, and be sure to follow us on all the socials where you'll find us at Stones Lip Pod. I'll be back with another Stones chat very soon. Till the next time, we say goodbye.